Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Practice is an organizing principle. That idea arose in the conversation that Peter Vaill and I had the last time. And in this conversation, we want to develop that more fully. It's quite intriguing, and I think you'll agree. Well, Peter, the last time we spoke on microphone, an idea came to you, which I will, of course, steal and call it my own someday. No, I'm kidding. Where we thought of practice as an organizing principle for the individual and maybe for organizations of individual practitioners. But the notion of how that came up in our conversation is what I'd like to start off on, because it sounds to me like we were kicking up some dust that could be formed into something like a theory, even though we've been careful not to talk about theory in the same
I like
vein.
The expression way of thinking better.
Yeah. So is this an addition or build on to our way of thinking that we've introduced several times, or is this a parallel and compatible way of thinking about practice and thinking of it as an organizing principle?
Well, the expression just sort of popped out of me in our last conversation. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I meant a whole lot by it at the time, but just as you have been doing, the more I reflected on it, the more I thought there might be some juice there that warranted further thought. I think what I have in mind with that notion, and there certainly are other interpretations too, but what I have in mind with that notion is that if you think of any practice, it's an enormous jumble of things and people and procedures and problems and techniques. I mean, it's what is so daunting to a beginner, is because they just don't know where to start, and none of it makes a whole lot of sense to them. And I think what I thought then about practice as an organizing principle is that if a person started with a way of thinking about practice, whether it's the way of thinking that you and I have been using in these podcasts or some other way of thinking about practice, that if you start with a way of thinking about practice, it can be anyway an organizing principle, because the master can say to the apprentice, here's what you're doing when you're practicing this profession or this skill or this trade or whatever it is, and can then proceed to talk basically in the terms that we've been using in these podcasts, talk about practice, what it is, what the nature of practice is, and what its fundamental structure is, and what its objectives are, and what its relationship. One thing we've said consistently in these podcasts is that you can't really separate the practice and the practitioner.
Yes.
That it's not as if practice is some kind of freestanding entity that has to be somehow learned or incorporated by the beginner. That in fact, the practice is, I would say, from the very beginning, the practice is an interaction between the person and the traditions and techniques and methods and the things, the tools, all of that. It's an interaction between the two, so that as the practitioner matures in his or her practice, less and less can you distinguish it. Can you say here's the practice and here's the practitioner as two different things. And I think it's why so many practitioners who are ostensibly practicing the same thing, in fact, they discover that there are some really interesting differences between the way one does it and the way another does it. It's not absolute differences. They can still communicate with each other. They can still be on the same page, so to speak. But nevertheless, each practitioner has his or her own way of looking at things. I have this demonstrated to me quite vividly as I move among all the different doctors that I'm presently a patient of, and the way they talk about each other and the way they refer to each other's practice and each other's values and each other's priorities is quite interesting. In no case does anybody badmouth anybody. That you wouldn't even say they're critical of each other, but you can sort of read between the lines and tell that that when one practitioner speaks of another, basically, as I say, reading between the lines, basically you can see that the individual is saying, well, Dr. So-and-so has his way of doing things, and I have mine.
That's a key phrase. That's right.
Even though they both might be pulmonologists or something. So it's complicated, as they are saying these days about relationships. It's not easy to communicate what the interaction is between practitioner and practice, and yet it's very real. And I think if you come down to the concrete level of any individual practice, you could talk about your way of swinging a golf club, or I could talk about my way of sailing a boat, and it would bear some relation to the way others swing golf clubs and sailboats. But nevertheless, the more you mature in the practice, the more it becomes your own way of doing things. And that's vividly demonstrated in organized sports, where you can see there are so many interesting differences between the way human beings swing bats or swing golf clubs, for that matter. And video instant replay and slow motion and all of that has brought some of those realities home to the general public. I'm always impressed with, I think I originally used to be impressed by John Madden, but now I see it's true of other color commentators, also in football. You know, they run the play, and there's this jumble of humanity crashing into each other. And then suddenly up on the screen comes the word flag. And so Chris Collinsworth or somebody says, well, Al, there's a flag on the play. I think number 779 at left tackle is going to be called for holding. Well, you know,
how did they spot it?
I could watch that. I could watch those bodies crashing together for hours, for years, and still not see number 79 holding. And yet, when they run it in instant replay or whatever, that you say, "Oh yeah, there he is. He's got a hold of his jersey, or whatever it is. He's got a hold of his face mask." Sometimes you can see it as it's happening, but most of the time, I, as a interested but very unskilled observer, need the color commentator to tell me what has just happened on that play. Or you see this same phenomenon when somebody breaks down somebody's golf swing, and some color commentator on a golf course will say, there he goes hooking again. He has a tendency to hook, and you can see it in his swing. Well, I can't see it in his swing.
You can see it in mine. You put a camera.
Well, do you have a tendency to hook?
No, I'm more of a slice guy.
Yeah, me too. When I was swinging a golf club, I always sent it into the next county to the right.
They put out a warning when I won the course, but I think that notion of a way of doing things that emerges, it becomes an identifier of people, particularly those of high accomplishments like these commentators. This way of doing things. What I'm hearing you say is some of it is acquired through training, observation, coaching, mentoring, however the words go from its outside in, people setting up examples. Here, try it like this. Practices, best in quotes, best practices, which we've talked about. But in here is the maker of one's practice. From a theoretical standpoint, it's almost like a person is developing one's own personal theory of how they want to be, whatever that be is, a golfer, a teacher,
Yeah,
a bottle washer.
I called that a practice theory.
Yeah.
Little essay I wrote, gosh, way back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Because after interviewing a bunch of organization development practitioners, I perceived that each had his or her own way of thinking about how to practice. And so I wrote this little essay called Practice Theories in Organization Development, and I tried to sketch what I thought the nature of a practice theory was. And it's just, that's perhaps an overly elaborate phrase. It's just my way of doing things, my way of thinking about how to do these things.
Yeah, but in a way, it is it's theoretical in the sense that you're constantly testing it. It's not a given that your way of doing things will remain that way, or even if it is that way, it's an expression. Someone could write it down or speak it, be recorded saying it. But my sense of that is that, well, there's some regularities in regard to that story one tells about their way of doing things. There's also these and yet or buts, or in the case of, and next thing you know, it's back under development again, which I sense is pretty damn exciting.
It's what keeps the practice vibrant and challenging and rich and interesting.
Yeah,
keeps it from getting stale in the mind and in the behavior of the practitioner. Yeah.
Well, but I think it does, but one has to back to our conscious in the first word of our way of thinking about practice, a conscious intention to achieve results. So that as people listen to this in our conversation, I like them to first see if they have popping up in their minds their own theory of doing things, whatever that may be, just to see how quickly it can come to mind if you intend to bring it to mind.
Yeah.
And examine it and put it out there for others. I had an hour prior to our call, and I used to be an examiner for the National Performance Excellence Award called the Baldrige Quality Award.
Oh, yeah.
It was a great experience. I did it for a couple of years. And so I still stay tuned to what the Baldrige framework, a word we used in our last conversation, is looking like these days and how it's affecting.
Is it still around?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, the federal money kind of went away, but they've kept it going within National Institute of Test and Measures, I think. And anyway, they had the superintendent of a technical school district in Oklahoma that won the National Quality Award in 2018 among 2 or 3 other institutions. And I listened to him today. He had his slides prepared, and he told the story of how this technical school system, I think it was called 3 counties, went from obscurity to national recognition over about a 20-year period. But as he was talking, I was thinking, he's telling his story too, but he wasn't saying, and then I did this, and then I did that. It was we all the way along, and it was about a manifest organization that Baldrige criteria can help you identify in terms of its working parts. But I was thinking also, first he sounded very kind, very humble, but I think he the best part of the way he came through was he said, "Now I would love to hear from people because we're not there yet. We're nationally recognized, but we got a long way to go." And that sort of thing translated to from the we to I. I'm not there yet. I've got a long way to go. Seems to me to be admirable and having something to do with a person accepting that their success is theoretically achieved right now, but it could change tomorrow for the good or for the worse. Anyway, rambling along with that anecdote, but I think it does tap into two things. First, the individual is constantly organizing oneself intentionally to achieve a state of practice. And then secondly, organizations also have a number of different frameworks for organizing these days. The Baldrige Performance Excellence Criteria is only one. There are probably another 50 or 100 models that corporate leaders examine to see if they could put them into effect to get better results. But I'd like to go back to the person again and his or her practice theory. More thoughts?
Yeah. Well, it very definitely does evolve with maturing in the practice. But to tie it back to the original idea here of the organizing principle, the existence of the practice gives the developing practitioner a framework or a context, that would be a good word, I think, within which you are becoming a practitioner of this particular field or profession or whatever it is. I'm reminded of there was a cantankerous Harvard biologist, I guess he was, but he named Lawrence J. Henderson, who was a contemporary of Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger and that whole gang who did the Hawthorne researches. And Henderson was famous for saying lots of different things. He was quite a quotable man, and as I say, cantankerous. But one of his that I liked a lot was, "Without a theory, thinking seems to be impossible." Without a theory, thinking seems to be impossible. And once again, the theory is the kind of organizing principle, the framework, the context within which one frames one's own particular point of view. And you could almost say without a practice, practice seems to be impossible. You are still stuck with all the bits and pieces lying around, and it's hard to shape them into a practice without a sense of practice as an organizing principle. We've also talked a little bit about the interest that practitioners may have in what the academic world calls theory.
Yeah.
And I'd like to connect that in here because it's right on this point that practitioners and theoreticians have difficulty communicating. The point being that each have different organizing principles. And the organizing principle that dominates American social science is positivism and objectivism. The belief that the researcher and theoretician's job is to discover and explicate some pre-existing truth that is somehow out there, independent of any perceiver or any theoretician, until it is discovered and articulated. And positivism and objectivism are not certainly the only philosophies of science. And in some parts of the world, not even the dominant parts, not even the dominant forms of theory. But it's taken hold in American social science, so that now, if you want to get tenure, or if you want to get your dissertation accepted, you've got to have a body of data, and the body of data has to be independent of you, and it has to be very clear that you have not in any way contaminated your data with your own values, with your own quirks and idiosyncrasies. And you go to great lengths to make sure that things correlate at the 05 or the 01 or the 001 level.
Yeah.
Standards that might be appropriate for trying to discover a new vaccine for cancer.
Yeah, white mice,
But you wonder sometimes if these standards that dominate the research enterprise that is made available to practitioners is the most useful one for most practitioners. There are, I suppose, practitioners whose practice is heavily dependent on science and highly replicable results, in which the values of the researcher play no contaminating part. But that's not the practice that most practitioners are practicing. They don't need validity at that level of precision, and yet for awarding tenure or awarding doctoral degrees, even in the most everyday subjects like marketing or something, the candidate has to show that he or she has utilized these techniques and standards that evolved for a very different research enterprise in physics or biology, and not in the practice of business subjects or public administration subjects or health services administration subjects or whatever. The practitioner tends to be more of a quick and dirty and get on with it framework.
Sure.
Frame of mind, I meant to say.
They're in white water. They can't they can't find that quiet spot, remember?
And so they don't want to proceed. They don't want to proceed on invalid grounds. But their standards for valid grounds are, I don't want to say lower, but their standards for valid grounds are, what's a good word for this?
Forgiving.
Perhaps a little forgiving, a little looser, a little more situational than the standards for validity that the cancer researcher or was practiced in the Food and Drug Administration or wherever.
right.
And do I know how valid my findings are from my doctoral dissertation of 70 years ago? Well, I don't know, but I did feel sometimes that I was being asked to demonstrate how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And that was in an actually a quite forgiving research environment that the Harvard Business School at that time was heavily dominated by the case method of approaching things. But I had to have a valid sample, and I had to have spent a valid amount of time in the field, and I had to have interviewed in a valid way to get my data. All those standards which did not evolve in sciences like I was at that time practicing, but instead evolved in sciences that were far more disciplinary than I was practicing. Furthermore, the practitioner is concerned with taking an action that will generate valid future conditions. The practitioner is thinking, in a way you could say the practitioner is thinking horizontally, whereas the scientist is thinking vertically. The scientist is trying to get as much accuracy out of this one slice of reality so that he or she can then build it into a broader theory of that phenomenon. And I sometimes think that the two points of view, the horizontal and the vertical, are quite incompatible with each other, and that furthermore I sometimes chafe under the influence that the vertical standards and values have on our practitioners with their horizontal interests in getting on with it and introducing change and so forth. Now, sometimes someone might say, horrors, are you inviting practitioners to proceed on potentially invalid grounds?
Yes.
And
potentially.
Well, potentially, yes. But I'm inviting practitioners to proceed on grounds that make sense in that situation.
That's right.
Not that necessarily make sense by the standards of objectivist science, but that make sense in that particular context. And I'm trusting that that practitioner will sense if the inquiry is going off on the wrong direction. And when I call it an inquiry, a course of action is actually an inquiry.
I like that idea too.
It is as if the action taker is asking the question, in these circumstances, will this action work?
That's right.
And the only thing they have of knowing whether it will work is to go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
W. Edwards Deming, the father of total quality management, made this mentality famous with his little mantra: plan, do, check, act.
That's right.
Plan as much as you can. Act then within the context of your plan. Check the results, and if the results are the ones you want, act. Go ahead. And if they're not the ones you want, initiate a new plan, do, check, act sequence.
That notion of the pragmatic approach to life that a number of folks of his generation and who preceded him seemed to find quite comfortable and normal and whether they're academics or whatever, consultants. And then it did start to get a little bit crazy, particularly in the social sciences, when data, prove it with data, seemed to take hold. I have a quick feeling of regret that some of those changes have happened, because the people you've named, including your name, from my standpoint, put all kinds of their own thought and value into what came out in print about how the world works.
Sure.
I mean, it was, and we would name these people. We'd say Charles Peirce, the father of American pragmatism, and on and on. And nowadays, I do get these journals still from the American Academy of Management. I get them online now, and I glance at the subjects, and I read the abstract sometime, and I think, well, maybe it's because that's where I am in my life right now, but I feel kind of sad, because we call in our world it a management association, meaning that we are providing theoretical material validated to some degree for people who build and manage organizations, and that gap seems to be widening. Because I do also, and always have, kept my eye on what we call the popular literature, and I get a whole lot more juice out of some of these things in Fast Company than I do in Journal of Management. And I know that makes me somewhat of a Luddite, but I really love finding out how people think, to the extent of they have a way of doing things, and then I want to know how they came to it, and I want to be able to project where that's going. So that's just me. But what about this gap?
I think that's your practice theory.
It is my practice theory
in relation to practice and practitioners.
Yes.
You have found that to be a fruitful approach to the thinking of practitioners.
Yes.
You can sit around until hell freezes over waiting for some group of practitioners to ask for validity at the 05 level, and nobody's going to even know what the question is, much less are they going to have a ready answer for you.
Oh, I have to throw in one more story here, because it just came up yesterday. I don't know if I've mentioned to you from time to time, but one of my former students is a project manager for companies that put window systems on very tall buildings, like in downtown Manhattan.
Yeah.
And he called me yesterday to wish me happy holidays. So I said, Brian, how's that project going? He said, well, we're on the 58th floor. We've got 32 more floors to go.
Wow.
And so he said, it's kind of crazy. He said, we hit every mark in our contract, and then other contractors didn't come through at the right time, and now it's getting cold. We've got a crane up there. But he said, one way or another, we're going to clad those other stories right through the winter. And I said, wow. He said, yeah, we, every day we figure we get our head together and we say, okay, what can we do with the window system so that if we move it up and it's below 32 degrees, it won't contract when we put it in, to the extent that it'll then expand again, or vice versa. So, here's physics. There's validity, but but they're doing sort of back pocket physics to figure out expansion and contraction, but they know about it because they live with it, and they also know about weather and wind, and they know about the quality of aluminum and glass, but moreover, they're constantly interacting with other contractors, with lawyers or the owners, with their own corporate, saying, we gave you
labor unions.
Oh, well, and these guys who lay out those windows in New York City, they make, I'm guessing, well over $100 an hour. And they're tougher than the steel that they put up there. So imagine how Brian, who when he first started, when he left my school, he was like 23, and they put him in charge of a project on Times Square, which was failing, and that was his test. There's practice again.
Wow.
He figured it out. He worked with him. He knew how to get along. He's, he grew up making things. He was a cook to get his way through school, so he knows how to run a kitchen. So all of those abilities seem to form into now he's about 16 years into this practice, and he's probably one of the 5 best in the world at the cladding of skyscrapers. And I'm so impressed. But, talking to him, just like you just said a moment ago, he said, I'm still trying to figure it out, Doc. He says, just when I think I've got this one pegged, a bird flies into it and poops on it. He also said, and let's get back to this good thinking we're doing, but he said, Doc, you just come down on the train. He says, I'll take you up. We moved our shack, which is their office, from the ground floor to the 58th floor. And he said, I'll bring you up there. I said, no friggin' way. No way, no way. These feet stay on the ground. I said, I'll happily wave at you. But that's also the part that you don't always find in these more contained researchers. He's in a state of inquiry all the time, but he's also in a state of excitement. He's excited.
Yeah.
He is damn excited. When he pulls those results, Peter, whatever they may be, it's just like those guys you mentioned on a football field. He's closer to the goal. He loves talking about it.
Yeah.
He'd love to show me, and I guess I will go down there and see him at some point, just to honor that enthusiasm. But that's so different than the sterile tables and tables upon tables and the 6 conclusions at the end of the standard research chapter, 5 of which you can't understand. I'm just being a little hard on that population of thinkers. But I need more people who get excited about my guys like Brian, who are like you did once when you went up to New Hampshire. You told that story. It was so cold, your gear shift broke off, and you watched those paper makers and you watched them fix that runaway machine, and you got some real good thought out of that. That's what Brian's offering to me. And I'm an investigator too. I'm curious. I want to know, and then I want to extrapolate from what he's figured out in those really critical moments and see if I can use it to teach someone else, or at least feel smarter about how real practice works in real time with real people.
Sure. Well, you apologize at the beginning. If you could take a minute for this anecdote.
I never take a minute for an anecdote.
but it so beautifully captures what we're trying to do in these podcasts, and what I think we're trying to do in opening up the nature of practice and the way practitioners think, and what an exciting enterprise it is, and all of that. If I can make a personal comment, which will embarrass you, I suppose, but the mentality that you just displayed in sketching that practitioner and his world, that's the mentality that led me to invite you onto this project. Because as you and I have talked over the years, many times, I'm continually impressed with that feel you have for how these individuals think and work, and more importantly, because of you and I being professors, and how to bring that awareness into the classroom in the form of exercises and particular case studies, or particular readings and so forth. How to introduce that feel, that mentality to the students, who are just not hearing it from too many of their professors who are fascinated by their subject matter, but their way of picking up the subject matter is not the way that practitioners pick up that same subject matter, and it's not the way the students are going to be picking it up in just a few short months when they graduate and get out. So I'm really glad you took a minute to sketch that. I was also thinking, as you talked about the famous public relations disaster that John Hancock had in Boston.
That was before his time, but
yeah,
but you're right.
Those windows that kept popping out of the 60 or 80-story building on Copley Square in Boston. And that's the dark side of his practice, that never in a million years would he want to be held responsible for having goofed that badly in whatever turned out to be wrong. I guess they finally did solve the problem, so the windows aren't jumping out of the building anymore.
Well, there was a harder side of research that I'm sure evaluated those causes years back, and some of that does get fed in through professional communications to people like Brian, and I'm sure he picks up on all of that. But the point you just made about those window systems hanging 100 stories above some of the busiest streets in the world, the results that he achieved have to be as close to perfect as you can get in very imperfect materials and everything else. And those last moments when those human hands are laying those systems in and screwing them down and doing all the things they need to reinforce them, that's the part we talk about a lot in practice. It doesn't always come through in even management literature. What about those so-called laborers who are up there risking their necks to get those things right? What's going on in their minds? Are they thinking about supper? Are they hungover? Do they hate Brian and want to show the guy by maybe leaving a couple of screws off? We can really take that one story, Peter, and we can turn it into quite a very large set of concerns this young man carries with him every day when he goes out and rides up 58 floors to go to his. Okay, well, thinking about the sending of theory out to the practitioner world, which essentially colleges have been doing for generations, and then talking a bit about my friend Brian, I wonder about the other side, where we say in one of our conjectures that practice often precedes theory. So my question there, Peter, is how can we get, that I've loved doing, but how can more business schools, more of every kind of school, get more of that, I hate to use the word content or material, but getting more of that story in so that we can build theory around it? Or are we so rigidified now in our ways of collecting data that we don't even get out there?
That's my dread, is that the world of academe and a world of theory and the world of so-called systematic inquiry has now walled itself off from the treasure trove of practical knowledge that is evolving continually among practitioners. It's happening right now among code writers for computer programming. It's happening among all kinds of software designers. It cries out for someone to find a way of, I want to say, dramatically bridging the gap, dramatically convincing the world of theory that, and the individuals who are hitching their wagon to that particular star, that there's gold in them there hills of practice, and I had a thought went through my mind. It was back when we were talking about organizing principles.
Yeah.
That somehow the organizing principle of theory has become so fussy and fastidious that practice is not even any longer much interested. There are lots of men like your friend Brian who could go to the local business school and tell some fascinating stories about the practice of their profession.
Yes, he.
But they too many of them, and they've said this to me, too many of them have lost interest in that. They find themselves standing in front of a class that is so out of it with respect to their world of practice, and so preoccupied with trivia, or what he perceives as trivia, or might perceive as trivia, that don't even bother. They have their own professional association.
Yep.
They get together and they tell their own war stories. They occasionally they find a quasi-theoretician who speaks their language, like yourself, and comes in and maybe gives a dinner talk or something. But the gap is getting wider and wider and harder to bridge. And somehow the organizing principle of practice has to be made more real for academicians, theoreticians.
Yeah.
And that's why your anecdote of a few minutes ago is so useful, because you get it. You got that he had an organizing principle for his world.
Oh, yeah.
And it was not necessarily the organizing principle of some highly academic theory about the expansion rate of aluminum correlated with temperature or something. Or he might be very interested in the expansion rate of aluminum correlated with temperature, but it's buried in an article and published in a journal that is so far removed from his interest and his awareness that he never gets access to that one datum that might be very interesting to him.
And it could have sped up, some of their decision making, or it could have, taken away half of their conjectures about, keeping that fit. And see, that's the frustration too. And I'm wearing you out here, but maybe wearing our listeners out. But sometimes I'll go back to the library at the university where I worked, and you see kids, their heads are down on, well, they're not sleeping, but they're going through pages of material and they're writing notes and all of that. And I'm thinking, that's great. It's great that they're there to kind of be determined readers of whatever the theories that their teachers are asking them to consider. But here's the frustration. Within a year or two of the time they leave that school, whatever path they may have chosen has some theoretical boundaries to it, it's all going to be gone in terms of their memory, and they're going to have to get fresh material and or make it up for themselves and with others. And so the shelf life of when we were working together in school, Peter, 50 years ago, that material could hang on there quite a while. But we've talked often in these podcasts about how fast change is working now. So the idea that Brian may have even read something in one of his physics classes, if he took physics as a general elective, might have stuck in his head a little bit. But boy, wouldn't he have a great time sitting down with one of our physicists right now and talking about the practical matters of getting that material up there in 80 mile an hour wind at minus 20 degrees. So yeah, that would be a hell of a conversation. And when I was public service dean many years ago, that's exactly what I was working to do. I'd find smart folk out there in Western Maine, paper makers, you name it, and I'd say, I'd like you to meet my friend Professor Jones. He loves, he might love this stuff, and I'd bring them together, and then eventually they might cook up some kind of a project idea that I could then turn into a grant. Always a motive there, but at least to try to make that marriage happen. And it was easier up in Western Maine because very few people really put on airs, and very few snobs could stand being up there for 10 or 12 years at a time. So they either had to get over themselves and become interested in that guy on the next stool at the Farmington Diner, or they were going to be miserable human beings. So it was easier for me to get those bridges made. But now, I don't even know if I could make that happen up there, because I know that same thing we've talked about, that same icing over of the warm and fuzzy aspects of thinking new thoughts in order to produce the material for referee journals has even hit these small little schools, and faculty can't get promoted unless they have data sets. So anyway, summarizing, because we're at the end of our usual time allotment, my thought about practice as an organizing principle is that, yes, practice is organized by the individual to become more and more of what would be outwardly viewed as a practice, but in their heads, it's always a big question as to what will come next and what am I going to have to know in time to handle it. And so I just love us being able to say to people, organizing is a good thing. What's your final thought on this?
I don't want to leave the conversation without mentioning the name of one of our colleagues whom you may know, David Bogie.
Sure.
Who has been carrying the flag for alternative narratives on what research is all about, what validity is all about, what the interesting questions are, why they are interesting, why this alternative way of talking about validity is needed. And he has a following within the Academy of Management, within the Organizational Behavior Teaching Society. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether his following is growing or shrinking. I'm sure his followers have told him, "This is fascinating, David, but I'll never get promoted with a dissertation that is written on your principles."
Sadly, that I think the last I'd picked up on that trend, it's true, and I've always been a bit of I don't like to fit in any particular square hole, because I am a round peg, and so I've always felt some affinity to people who wanted to try a Bogie approach or other aspects of more qualitative research, as we call it in our jargon, and feel sadly because I have these conversations with them. I'd love to do that. I just can't. Not until I get my dissertation in.
But not until I get tenure.
Or this or that. And we even talked the last time about how sometimes people throw so much of that into just reaching that tenured promoted stage that after that, when they're supposed to spring loose and try some of this new thinking and new approaches to figuring out how things work in the world, they don't. They're stultified. They've lost the spark.
Yeah.
But there's still plenty who haven't. And
I got tenure at UCLA and tenure again at the University of Connecticut, talking the way I talk.
Yeah.
And there is hope.
There is hope, and that's a great note for us to end on. And we'll see where we head up for our next conversation. In the meantime, thank you for some really great thinking.
Thank you, for heaven's sakes.